called attribute syntax. It is called attribute syntax because the content attribute is used to set the button's content property. Now, this attribute syntax allows you to assign only a simple value to a property, like in this case the string @customer. But what if you want to assign a more complex object to the button's content property? If you want to do that, you can use the so-called property element syntax. Let me show you that syntax and let's use it to set the button's content property. So let's remove here from the button element the content attribute. Now first, let's add a closing element to that button. Inside of the button element, let's use an opening angle bracket and let's write button dot. And now you see here a list with all the properties of the button class. Let's use here the content property and let's close this element. Now inside of this property element, I specify the text @customer. So now you see, this button element here maps to the button class. It creates an object of the button class. That's why this element is also called an object element. This element here is inside of that object element and it maps to the button's content property. It consists of the class name, a dot, and the property name. And this is now a so-called property element. It maps not like normal elements to a class, instead it maps to a property. Inside of the button element, you can specify multiple of these property elements. So you could set, for example, the button's background property, and you could assign a linear gradient brush to that background property. But let's remove this again. Let's just focus on the content property. First, let's run our WPF project, and you see the button has still the text @customer. But this time, you know, we have used here the property element syntax to set this text. The property element syntax has now the big advantage that you can assign a complex object to the button's content property. So in this case, you could assign, for example, a stack panel to the content property. Let's use this to combine an image and text as a content for the button. So first, let's go to the Solution Explorer and let me right-click the project and I select from the context menu Add New Folder. I call this folder Images. Now let me right-click this Images folder and let's select Add Existing Item. On my machine, I select here Pictures and I select in this dialog All Files. Now I select here the Add PNG file that you also find in the exercise files that you can download from the course homepage on pluralsight.com. Let's add this file to the project. In WPF, you need to ensure that this PNG file has a build action of resource so that it gets included in the assembly. To do this, I right-click this file and I select Properties. As you can see, the build action is set to none. Now let's expand this drop-down and let's scroll down in this list, and here you can select Resource as a build action. Now let's go again to the SAML document. Inside of the stack panel, let's create an image element and let's set the source to the root of our project. Let's use the Images folder and the Add PNG file. I also give this image a height of 18 pixels. Now, in addition, let's create here a text block element that you can use to display a piece of text, and let's set the text property to add. Now let's run the application to see what the button looks like. As you can see, the button has now this image and the text add as a content. Now let's assume you want to arrange the image and the text horizontally. To do this, you don't have to stop the application. You can also keep it running, as you can edit SAML while the application is running. So let's move the application to the left side of my screen and Visual Studio to the right side. Now first, on this stack panel here, let's set the orientation property. The default value is vertical, which means the stack panel arranges the elements vertically. Let's set it to horizontal, and now you see the image and the text block are arranged horizontally. Let's also set on the button the width property let's set it for example to 75, and let's set a bit of margin between the image and the text block. To do this, you can set on the image element the margin property. You define the values in the order left, top, right and bottom. So now you see on the right side I specified 5 pixels, and so now we have a bit of space between the image and the text block. Great! Now you see you have used here the property element syntax to assign this stack panel with an image and a text block to the button's content property. In the next clip, you will learn about content syntax that allows you to omit the property element. You know already how to set properties in SAML with the attribute syntax. On this button, the attribute syntax is used to set the button's content property to @customer. In the previous clip, you learned how to set properties in SAML with the property element syntax. Setting the button's content property with this syntax looks like this. The property element consists of the class name and the property name separated by a dot. Property element syntax allows you to assign complex objects to a property, because you can use again object elements inside of the property element. The syntax that I want to show you in this clip is the content syntax, that is also known as content property syntax. It means that you can place content directly inside of an object element. In this case, you place the text @customer directly inside of the button element. Actually, this content syntax is like the property element syntax. You just omit the property element, which would be in this case button.content. But now the question with this content syntax is, why is here the value assigned to the button's content property and not to another property? How does the SAML parser know that it has to use the content property of the button? Let me explain you how this works. In WPF, the SAML document is read by the SAML parser. When reading the document, the SAML parser creates the objects from that SAML document. Now, when the SAML parser sees this button, it notices that the button element has content directly inside. The content is not assigned to a property by using a property element. This means that the SAML parser needs to find out to which property it should assign that content. To do this, the SAML parser looks for the content property attribute. In our sample here, it looks for that attribute on the button class, as the button element contains the content. The SAML parser finds the content property attribute on the content control class, which is a base class of button. As you can see, the content property attribute specifies the name of the property that the SAML parser should use, which is in this case the content property. In the last step, the SAML parser uses the property specified in the content property attribute and assigns the value. That means in this case of the button, it assigns the value @customer to the button's content property. So this is how the content syntax works, and it is used quite often in SAML. Actually, content syntax is always used when you put content in an object element without property element. Let me show you now in a demonstration that you set already properties with the content syntax in our code. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the main window SAML file of our WPF project. Now you see here in the window element there is directly a grid element and no property element is used. So here the question is already, to which property of the window is this grid object assigned? You can find this out by right-clicking here the window element. Then from the context menu you select Go to Definition. Now you can see here the window class. When you expand this here, you see it does not have the content property attribute. So let's right-click on the base class and let's select here Go to Definition. Now let's expand here the attributes, and here you see the content property attribute that defines the content property as a default property. So now let's go back to the main Windows SAML file. Now you know that this grid instance is assigned to the Windows content property. If you want, you can explicitly write here a property element window.content to assign that grid to the content property of the window. Let's also add the closing element. Now let's continue with the grid. It contains directly this button. So, to which property of the grid is the button assigned? Let's right-click the grid and let's select Go to Definition. When you look at the grid class, you don't see any attributes. So let's right-click its base class panel and let's select Go to Definition. Now let's look at the attributes of the panel class, and here you see the content property attribute that defines the children property as a content property. So let's go again to the main Windows SAML document, and now you can explicitly write here also grid.children, and then you put the button inside of that grid.children property element. Next, there is the button that has a property element to set its content property, and then there is the stack panel that contains directly an image and a text block. The stack panel inherits like grid from panel. So also here the children property is used that you could specify explicitly with a property element. Let's write here stackPanel.children. Now let's run the application and let's see if everything still works. The application comes up and here you can see the button with the image and the text block. So everything still works the same way as before. But as you can see, SAML gets much more verbose when you explicitly specify all these optional property elements. Usually, on a window, you want to set the content property. On a panel like grid and stack panel, you want to set the children property. And on a content control like button, you want to set the content property. Now, the content syntax allows you to omit all these property elements. Then SAML gets more compact and more readable. So let's remove here again the window content property element. Let's remove the grid children property element. Let's remove here also the button content property element. And let's remove the stack panel children property element. Now I also need to remove all the closing property elements. Stack panel children, button content, grid children, and window content. I press Ctrl+KD to format this document, and now you can see the SAML document is much more compact and much more readable than before. As you can see, the stack panel is now directly inside of the button. But when you look at the button space class, which is content control, you can see that the content property is specified with the content property attribute as a default property. Important to know is that even with the content syntax, you can still use other property elements inside of the button, for example button.background, to assign a brush to the button's background property. Now let me remove this again. Alright, so far to content syntax.